Clara Hollis walked the half-mile from her cabin to Abel Marsden's fence in the last light of an October day, the kind of light that turned the sage into copper and made a woman wonder why she'd ever thanked God for anything as ordinary as dusk. She carried a peach pie in both hands, the tin still warm through the folded dishcloth. The crust had split a little along the top, and the smell of it followed her like a second shadow. Her boots left clean prints in the soft dirt road. From the porch of her own place, she had watched his chimney all summer for any sign of smoke, and only in the last week had she seen one. So she had gone home and pulled the last good peaches from the tree behind her kitchen and set to work. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love knowing who's with us. She had not seen his face in 2 years. She had not spoken to him in 2.5. She had not been brave enough to call on him in the 4 winters since his wife Ruth and his daughter Lily had been carried out of that cabin in a pine box together. The mother first, the little girl a week later, both of them taken by the typhoid that came up out of the low country one wet August and did not leave until it had chosen its names. After the funeral, Abel had put a padlock on his front gate and walked back into the house and disappeared so completely from the common life of Millbrook that some folks in town had begun to refer to him as the ghost on Marsden's Creek. The names for him were ugly and quiet. People spoke them when they thought Clara might not hear, which meant they often spoke them when she could. Clara was no stranger to grief. She had earned hers with the slow, patient bitterness of a woman who had been told she was lucky and then had the ground tested beneath her. Her husband, Thomas Hollis, had been a careful man with a fiddle and a bad knee, who had worked the ore veins at the Silver Slipper mine because the small cattle operation he'd inherited would not feed 2 people, and the mine offered $40 a week more than any ranch in the valley. He had refused an offer from a man named Hollis Creed to buy the homestead cheap. 6 months later, Thomas was crushed under a timber brace that should have been replaced for a year. The inquest was over in an afternoon. The widow got no widow's pension, no apology, no share of blame. She got the cabin's standing debt, and a printed bill for the doctor's attendance at his death, which she had paid off in 4 installments at 50 cents a week. That was 6 years ago. She had been alone ever since, and she had learned to be alone the way a horse learns to find water on its own, by repetition, by failure, by the particular gift of stubbornness that small ranchers inherit whether they want it or not. She still wore Thomas's wedding ring on a leather cord around her neck, under her dress. She still said his name once a week, on Sundays, into the porch air, so that someone alive would hear it. Now she walked the road toward Abel's gate with the pie. Her shadow went before her. The air smelled of cooling sage and the coming frost, and the faint sweet rot of the fallen peaches in her own orchard that no one would ever pick. She set the pie down on the gatepost. She knocked twice, firmly, the way a woman knocks when she has practiced it in her head for a week and no longer intends to apologize for coming. A long silence. The cabin remained quiet. Then a curtain moved. A latch lifted. The door opened 3 inches, no more, and she saw a single eye and the side of a nose and a brown beard going gray. "Mr. Marsden," she said, the same way his mother might have said it. "My name is Clara Hollis. I live down the road. I have brought you a peach pie." Nothing came back. The eye did not blink. "I have seen your chimney," she said. "I was glad to see it. The smoke. It has been a long time." The eye blinked. The door did not move. "Set the pie on the gatepost," he said, and closed the latch. She heard the bolt slide home. She heard the curtain drop. She stood there for another full minute, listening to her own breath come back to her in small clouds in the cold air. She did not weep. She had not come here to weep. She came here because a pie is an honest reason to knock on a door, and a door that closes all the way is a door that does not feel like a door anymore. She picked up the empty dishcloth. She walked home in the dark, slower than she came because the frost was already laying itself out on the road like a clean sheet. She went back a week later, with cornbread. The 3rd time, she brought broth in a jar with a cloth tied over the top. The 4th time, in November, when the first snow had not yet come but the air smelled like it, the door came open a full 12 inches. She saw a yard of his shirt, and his hand on the frame, and the inside of the cabin behind him. Thin, neat, cold, well swept. "I cannot pay you for these," he said. His voice sounded like a fence wire in the wind. "I'm not asking you to pay me, Mr. Marsden. I have not invited you in." "No, Sir, you have not. He closed the door a few inches. Then he stopped and did not close it the rest of the way. Come in then, he said. Just this once. And the way he said the last 3 words told her what she'd been walking toward for a month of Sundays. So began the second part of her winter, which she thought of privately as the part in which she made it her business to be allowed to sit at a man's table for 15 minutes without being asked to explain herself. She came once a week. She came twice a week after the second week. She brought bread, broth, jam, on one occasion a small jar of pickled peaches that she had set back for company she had not yet made. She never knocked harder than her first knock. She never stayed longer than a man of any age would have wanted her to. She always washed her own dish before she left it, even when he had not asked. She always said her name on her way out the door, the way bank tellers say goodbye, so that when the door closed he would remember who had been there. Slowly, by such patient, ugly degrees, a man began to speak to her. The first words out of him after months were about the wood stove. The second were about the buck he had seen on the North Ridge in October. The third were about his wife's name, said one afternoon when she had been pouring water from a kettle into a basin and had not been looking at him at all. Ruth. The name hung in the kitchen air for nearly a minute. She did not repeat it. She did not thank him for it. She wiped her hands on her apron and asked him if he wanted more broth, and he said, "No, thank you, ma'am," and that was the conversation. It was not nothing, though. Up the road at the Bighorn Trust, where Hollis Creed sat behind a desk the color of dried blood, it was not nothing. Creed had been patient the way men with money are patient, which is to say he had waited for men without money to come round to his way of thinking. He had watched Abel's smoke start up. He had seen the small figure of a woman going up the road. He had not liked either of them, and he had set his clerk to find out why a woman with nothing would be bringing things to a man with nothing. The clerk came back on a Tuesday with a paper folder. His Ruth, the clerk said. Her name was Ruth Marsden. She came to Mr. Creed in the spring of '85, asked for $50 to pay for medicine for the girl, and Mr. Creed gave her $75, with interest at 2% a month, compounded, and a chattel mortgage on the cattle, signed in front of 2 witnesses, neither of them the husband. What does it come to? $264, said the clerk. I have here the note. I have here the original ledger entry. I have here a foreclosure notice that was issued in March of this year, signed by Mr. Creed. Whose name is on the chattel mortgage? Her name. Hers and her mark. An X. Hers alone. Mrs. Marsden is 4 years dead. Yes, sir. Then why have we not taken the property? Because, said the clerk, he has not come out of his house, sir. And Clara Hollis has not brought us the deed. And because Mr. Creed has had other ways of acquiring property without the paperwork. It was the first time in 6 years anybody had said Clara Hollis's name in front of Hollis Creed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which he had decorated himself, originally, and when the bank inspector was last through, with a most particular smile. Then let us ask her, said Creed. The letter came the second week of December. The envelope was cream and smelled faintly of pomade. The words were written in longhand by a clerk with a fine pen. It asked, with great courtesy, that Mrs. Hollis consider calling at the Bighorn Trust at her earliest convenience to discuss a matter pertaining to the late estate of Mr. Marsden. If Clara had been a different woman, she might have read it 3 times and put it in the stove and gone on with her bread. But she had been taught by her time alone to read a piece of paper twice before folding it, and to read any piece of paper whose first word was convenience 3 times. So she read it 3 times, and then she sat down at her kitchen table and thought for a long time about what a banker might want from a woman who had nothing a banker might want. She thought of her late husband's refusal. She thought of the brace that had not been replaced. She went up the road to Abel Marsden's gate and asked, through the door, whether he had received any letter from the trust. His voice, when it came, was careful. He had not. She asked whether his wife had ever borrowed money from Mr. Creed. The silence that followed was a long one. He said, finally, that he had been told she had not. Clara went home with that, sat down at her kitchen table again, and took out of her drawer the papers she kept from her husband's estate, which she had been keeping because Thomas's mother had kept papers, and his mother before that. Among the papers she found what she had not known was there. In the 3rd year after Thomas's death, when she had gone to Creed herself for a small loan against the homestead to see her through a winter, the clerk had given her a paper to sign and she had signed it without reading it because her eyesight had been bad and she had trusted him. She had been paying the debt down by $2 a month for 3 years. She had assumed she was paying off a simple loan. When she held the paper this time to the lamp, she read it all the way through, and she saw what she had not seen at 15, that the chattel mortgage she had signed was on her late husband's cattle, not on her own. That the figure it carried against her name was not $250, but $912. That the clause at the bottom, signed by a witness she did not know, would have entitled Creed to take the homestead outright if she had missed a single $2 payment, which she had not, but which any small accident could have made her miss. She sat with that paper for an hour. Then she folded it up and put it back in the drawer and went to bed. She did not sleep. Now we know the shape of the season. The question is not whether Clara will face him. The question is what you would have done in her place. Some of you are watching this, and you know exactly what you'd have done because you've sat at a kitchen table and looked at a piece of paper that should not have been allowed to exist. Some of you would have ridden away. Some of you would have ridden to town. Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know what you would have done. In the morning, she rode to town. She has one good mare and a side saddle she had inherited from a sister-in-law who had died at 31, and she wears it because she has always believed a woman should look like what she intends to be. She came down the high street at 10 in the morning, in a dress with a fitted bodice Thomas's mother had sewn, with her hair tied back under a plain hat, with the deed to her homestead in a leather envelope against her ribs. She did not dismount at the Bighorn Trust. She dismounted at the office of the Bittersweet Gazette, a 2-room newspaper on the second floor of a paint-peeling building, where a printer named Joseph Ewing had, for the last 11 years, been quietly assembling a record of the political economy of the valley. He was the only man she trusted in town. He had printed Thomas's funeral notice gratis. He had printed her own card of thanks the year after, when she had knitted 97 pairs of mittens for the poor children of the village and wanted a notice to go in. He had been a friend of Thomas's father very long ago. He received her in his back office, which smelled of ink and slightly of horse. He read the paper once and then again. He set his pipe aside. He took off his spectacles. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, "where did you get this?" She told him. He looked at her for a long minute. "Have you told Mr. Marsden?" She said that she had not. He said that she ought to, and write carefully, and that he ought to be told before she told anyone else, including Creed, because what she had in that leather envelope was not just her own case. It was his too. And then he asked, "Are you prepared?" She said she did not understand the question. He said, "Are you prepared to have this be your name in the front of the paper every week, until somebody listens?" She thought of her kitchen, her orchard, her lonely stove. She thought of Thomas's wedding ring on the cord. She said yes. For the next 3 weeks, she lived 2 lives. On Monday and Thursday, she went to Abel's cabin with soup and bread, and she sat in his kitchen and she watched him say, slowly, "Ruth borrowed money." Ruth was afraid. Ruth did not tell me. On Saturday, she rode to town in the morning and she sat in the printer's back office and she signed her name to a deposition and to another, and she drank bad coffee, and she went home in the dark. She was not a brave woman. She had been raised to be a polite woman and a competent woman and a woman who kept her composure as a kind of courtesy. What she had not been raised to be was loud. But a friend of hers who had died had once told her, in the last year of her life, that the only thing louder than a loud man with a big checkbook was a quiet woman who was not afraid to read the small print. She had remembered that sentence for 8 years. She used it now. The first notice appeared in the Bittersweet Gazette on a Wednesday in early January, on page 3, between a recipe for sage hair and an advertisement for a new windmill. It named nobody. It described the structure of a chattel mortgage as it had been used by an unnamed lender in the valley. It described how compounding interest, applied monthly, turned small sums owed into sums impossible to repay. It described how a woman who had been lent $75 by her neighbor might, for years later, find herself owed $500 for a debt she had never seen in writing. The article used no proper names. It did not need to. Creed read it on Thursday and sent his clerk down to the newspaper office to ask, kindly, whether Mr. Ewing might be persuaded of the error of his ways. Mr. Ewing, who had been threatened several times in his life, showed the clerk to the door and asked him what the word courtesy meant in the front office in February. The clerk went home early. The folios ran through February. The second named the Bighorn Trust. The third carried an interview with a widow named Pearl Tabor, who had lost her place in '88 at the same bank in similar terms, and who, when asked by Mr. Ewing whether she had any comment, said only, "He does not pay for his prayers, and he does not pay for his loans. But he will, sir, he will." On the Saturday after the Pearl Tabor piece ran, a man named Harold Whipple, the bank's senior clerk since '85, came to Mr. Ewing's back office at 9 in the morning and sat down across from Mrs. Hollis without saying a word and laid out, neatly, a ledger book he had brought with him in an oilcloth wrap. The clerk said, "I have worked for Mr. Creed for 7 years, ma'am. He does not know I am here. He does not know what I have in this book. There are 17 names on these pages." He then went back to the bank and ate his lunch at his desk and pretended nothing had happened. That evening, Clara walked up the road to Abel's cabin and knocked, and when the door came open a full 2 feet, she said, "Mr. Marsden, I have something to show you." He said, "Come in, ma'am." That night, in his kitchen, with the lamp turned down low and the wood popping in the stove, she laid out the entire case. She laid out her own paper. She laid out the Tabor paper. She laid out the copies of the folios from the Gazette. She laid out, last of all, and with a great care she had practiced in her head, the book the bank clerk had given her that morning. Abel read the book for an hour without speaking. When he set it down, he asked the only question that had to be asked, which was, "How much do they want from me?" She said, the sum total, including his late wife's $75, was $312. He said, "If I had a cow to sell, I could pay them back." She said, "Mr. Marsden, you have 11 cows, sir." I counted from the road. He looked at her for a long, careful minute, and then, for the first time in 4 years, he laughed. It was the smallest laugh she had ever heard a man make. It was the most important laugh she had ever caused. In the first week of March, Hollis Creed sent 2 of his men up to the Marsden place. They came on a Wednesday at dawn. The driver of the buckboard was a man named Pugh. The second was a man whose name no one in town would ever swear to in court. Pugh had a writ of seizure. The second man had a single-action revolver and the calm of a person who had done this work before. They had come to take 3 of Abel's cows and to leave a notice of eviction, which they would have nailed to his gate if there had been no one there to receive it. They had not expected to find Clara Hollis sitting at Abel Marsden's kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a tin cup of coffee in her hands and a stack of papers spread in front of her in a neat row. They had not expected her, but there she was. She had stayed the night in the spare room for the first time, because the week before she had said to Abel, when they were both pretending to be discussing the practical problem of who might or might not ride into town at dawn, "I do not think we should be alone on Wednesday, Mr. Marsden." He had said, "No, ma'am," and they had left it at that. The knock at the door was a hard one. Pugh did not wait for an answer. Abel rose. Clara set her cup down. She said, "Stay." He stayed. The door came open and Pugh came in and said, "Mr. Marsden, sir, you'll have 3 cows out front by 7 if you please, and a signature on the bottom of this." She said, without raising her voice, "Mr. Pugh." Pugh looked at her. He knew her. He had been paid 10 cents in his time to deliver milk past her gate, and she had waved to him once every week. "Mr. Pugh," she said, "I have in my hand a deposition signed by 3 witnesses and notarized by Judge Fisk in Sheridan last week concerning a chattel mortgage issued in the name of a deceased woman against the property of a man who never signed it. I have also in my hand, in this envelope, a copy of the same deposition delivered to the office of the territorial delegate to Congress in Cheyenne on Friday last. If you take 1 cow from this man's property this morning, I will have you in front of Judge Fisk by Tuesday. If you wish to confirm anything I have just told you, you are welcome to ride to the Gazette office and ask Mr. Ewing to read it aloud for you." Pugh looked at the second man. The second man looked at his revolver. The second man looked at Clara. Clara did not blink. She had practiced that not blinking for 30 years. Pugh took the writ of seizure out of his pocket, folded it once, and put it back. He said, "Ma'am, I am merely following instruction." Clara said, "Then follow this one, Mr. Pugh." She handed him the file. He took it. He and the second man walked out of Abel Marsden's kitchen and got back into the buckboard and went down the road. Clara stood at the window until the buckboard was out of sight. She sat back down at the table. Abel was looking at her from across the room as if he had never seen her before, although he had, by her own count, for 111 times. The bullets went into the bank rather than the cabin. The Friday after Pugh's retreat, the Bittersweet Gazette published a special edition with the full depositions, the 17 names, and a front-page article by Mr. Ewing that called the conduct of the Bighorn Trust, by name and in plain language, predatory. On the same day, at 3 in the afternoon, the district marshal of the territory walked into the Bighorn Trust and placed Creed under arrest on the affidavit of Harold Whipple, sworn to that morning. Creed was given the option of being arraigned in the town of Buffalo or in the city of Cheyenne. He chose Buffett's colt for his horse to Buffalo and was accompanied by 2 of his own men and one he did not know who was a deputy, because the marshal had not discussed his methods in advance, except to the 2 men he meant to discuss them with. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep telling them. In the days that followed, Abel opened his gate. He had not opened that gate in 4 years. He oiled the hinges first, because he was the kind of man who would do a thing correctly. He came out on a Saturday and stood in his own yard for 10 minutes looking at his own tidy pasture and his own small herd, and at the fence post that had once carried a foreclosure notice and now carried only a small iron weather vane in the shape of a running mare. That same morning, Clara came up the road with a peach pie. Some of the peaches had been from her own tree. Some had been from the tree of a neighbor who had taken up a habit of bringing her the windfalls. The crust did not crack this time. She set the pie on the table he had cleaned and waited for him to speak. He did not speak for a while. Then he said, "Mrs. Hollis, I should like to ask your permission to say something." "You have it, sir." "You have been bringing me food, ma'am, since the 2nd week of October." "Yes, sir." "You did not know me." "No, sir. I knew your fence." He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. They were scarred hands. They had been hands that could lift a child onto a horse. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I would like, at some time, if you were willing, to bring you back a pie of your own. I am not a good cook, but I am a steady man, and I have a wife who has been dead 4 years, and I have a daughter who has been dead 4 years, and I have not let anyone walk into this house since. And you walked in, ma'am. You walked in, and you did not take any of it back with you." She said, "Mr. Marsden, you do not owe me a pie." "No, ma'am," he said, "I do not. I owe you something. I do not know yet what to call it, but I would like to call it something that has a Sunday in it." She did not answer him right away. She did not weep. She had not come into his kitchen to weep. She had come in to bring a pie and to wash a dish and to say her name on the way out. But she had also come in to wait for whatever it was he might one day want to say to her. And he had now, finally, said it. She lifted her cup of coffee in his direction. He lifted his. They drank. They sat at the table in his quiet kitchen with the lamp turned down low, and the wood popping, and the smell of the peaches coming up warm through the cloth. A man had opened his heart. A woman had walked the half-mile from her cabin with her hands full. They had met somewhere between a fence post and a kitchen table, somewhere between a foreclosure notice and a cooling window, somewhere between 2 sets of grief that had not known, until that October, how to stand next to each other without breaking. I have a friend of mine. She's not real, but she would have understood the shape of that morning perfectly. I think of her sometimes, putting biscuits down. I think of her, very often, pulling the last good peaches from a tree. They did not marry that year or the next. They married in the 3rd spring, after he had put a new door on the kitchen of her place, of her own place, because she had begun, somewhere in the 2nd year of their knowing each other, to spend 3 nights a week there. The preacher was the same one who had married Ruth, and the same one who had buried Lily. He had not known what to say when Abel had asked him, and so he had said the same words in the same order as he had said them the first time, and that was the right thing to do, because there was a kind of household being passed down from one life into the next, and the preacher understood that. Millbrook changed in ways that did not need to be measured. The little bank that survived Creed's arrest was run, briefly and carefully, by a woman named Etta Pugh, who was no relation to the driver of the buckboard. The Bittersweet Gazette received a subpoena, then a commendation, and then a subscription list twice as long as the one it had served before. Mr. Ewing bought his wife a new hat, which she did not particularly want, which she wore, in any case, to 4 church suppers. The creek murmured at the bottom of the pasture, where Abel had rebuilt the cattle crossing in his 2nd year of knowing them. There was a bell on the kitchen table, which Clara rang only when a child was needed for supper, and there was no child, but she liked the sound of it. The light came down. The pie smelled of peaches, of cinnamon, of butter, of nothing in particular except the small mercy that somebody had bothered to bake.